What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to the SFS channel. My name's Gavin, and today I've got some fantasy football lineup advice for you guys for Week 8 NFL action. I've got my must-start and must-sit players for this week's NFL games. But first, I want to thank you guys so much for the support on my videos the last 2 days. It really means a lot to me, and we got to keep that subscriber count going up so I can do some really cool giveaways and such in the future. So before this video gets started, each and every one of you guys needs to go down, if you haven't already, and hit that subscribe button and turn the bell on so you guys are notified every time I come out with a new episode. And let's get into the football. We're going to start off today's video with my must-start quarterbacks list, and my first guy up on the board is the Eagles QB Carson Wentz, who's got the Cowboys this week. Obviously, that defensive unit for Dallas has struggled immensely so far this season, and they are on pace to set records statistically for most yards allowed in a season, most points let up. There's just nothing that's going right for the Cowboys defense right now. They just traded away Everson Griffin, one of their best pass rushers, so Carson Wentz has everything going for him this week. I think he's going to throw for a lot of yards, and he's going to score as well. I think Carson Wentz has the upside this week to go over 300 yards passing, and I think that he has the upside to have at least 3 touchdowns, maybe even 4 total touchdowns this week. So Carson Wentz, definitely a guy I'm putting in my lineup this week. If you've got him, go start him. Another must-start quarterback for me. He's not quite as high as Carson Wentz is on my list for must-starts this week, but Derek Carr is another quarterback who deserves his respect. He's been really good this season. The Raiders had a little bit of a meltdown last week against the Bucs in the fourth quarter, but up until that point, the Raiders were very competitive. They were scoring points. Nelson Agholor actually looks like he might be someone you might want to target on the waiver wires in your league. He's been a deep threat for Derek Carr all season long, but Derek Carr against the Browns secondary is going to have a nice performance. Joe Burrow tore him up twice this season. Obviously, last week was his most recent performance. But I think Derek Carr is in line for a nice afternoon. I would say 250 yards passing, probably no turnovers, and 3 touchdowns for Carr this week. My next must-start quarterback for this week is one of my favorite value quarterbacks in fantasy football this year, and that's Teddy Bridgewater of the Carolina Panthers. Teddy B's got the Falcons this week, who have been opposing quarterbacks have been must-starts against them all season long. Atlanta obviously just has an atrocious secondary. There's so many injuries back there. They actually did a number on Detroit last week somehow and shut them down pretty well. It was a fairly low-scoring game for what people were expecting, but I would say that the Falcons are still a bottom-of-the-league defense, and I think that Teddy Bridgewater and Carolina offensive players are guys you want in your fantasy lineups this week. I just mentioned him a little bit ago. Joe Burrow is a guy who I would be starting in leagues this week. He's got the Tennessee Titans, who have shown that they are very susceptible to the deep ball. They give up big plays. They were very opportunistic against Ben Roethlisberger last week, and he threw some careless picks. He actually had 3 total, but Joe Burrow is a guy that I would be looking to start if you are in need of quarterback play this week. I think that there's a lot of potential to throw all over the Titans, just like the Steelers did last week. The Bengals have a lot of weapons on that offense, so I think Joe Burrow's got some nice upside this week, and I would look to play him if you are in need of quarterback assistance. Now into my must-start running backs list. Jonathan Taylor is my first guy up on the board, and he's got the Detroit Lions this week. I think that JT is in store for one of his bigger games so far this season. He's been a very consistent piece in fantasy lineups so far this year, but he really hasn't had that massive scoring output that people were looking for when they drafted him or what they even expected him to be once Marlon Mack went down way early in the season. But I think Jonathan Taylor breaks 100 yards for the first time since his Week 2 game against the Vikings, I believe. So JT, I think, is in for a big day. He might even get in the end zone a couple times as well. If you've been watching my trade advice videos, you know that Todd Gurley is a guy I've been telling you guys to sell on due to the brutal schedule he's got going forward here. And this is one of his few remaining games when I think he has some nice upside. His matchup against the Panthers this week is very favorable. I think that Todd Gurley can go for a nice amount of yardage and get into the end zone again this week. But looking forward past this week, I think Todd Gurley is a bit of a tough play. But for Week 8 purposes, Todd Gurley is certainly a startable player. I think that he puts up a very nice outing for your fantasy lineups. For the time being, we are not sure whether or not Miles Sanders is going to suit up for that Sunday Night Football matchup against the Cowboys. So in the meantime, while we're waiting to hear news on Sanders, Boston Scott is a must-start for me. I think that he's a guy who has really nice upside. Obviously, we saw what he did last week against the Giants, and this matchup is way more favorable than that one was. The Giants are obviously no game records in the run game, but I think that Boston Scott held his own, and he proved that he deserves to be started in fantasy leagues. Boston Scott's a guy who I think can get it done in the running and receiving aspects of the game for the Philadelphia Eagles. I think that he's flash potential to be productive in both aspects of the game. So I think that against a very weak defense like the Cowboys, Boston Scott has some very nice upside and potential for your lineups this week. Despite being a member of a running back by committee offense, Darrell Henderson is a guy who I'm giving the start to this week against the Miami Dolphins. I think that Darrell Henderson has been the most consistent and productive player out of the Rams' backfield so far this season. Unfortunately for Cam Akers owners, he's kind of fell out of the mix completely 2 weeks in a row without a carry, but Darrell Henderson and Malcolm Brown are certainly the guys to own in that backfield, and Darrell Henderson is the guy to play this week. And moving forward, he's kind of put his grasp around that job in the Rams' backfield. So Darrell Henderson, I think, in this favorable matchup is definitely the highest beneficiary in fantasy for the output that he's going to have this week just due to the matchup and the volume he's going to receive. I think that Darrell Henderson has a very productive outing, and he ends up getting in the end zone maybe and having a nice amount of yards from scrimmage as well. Now into my must-start wide receivers list, you're going to start to see kind of a trend here. Any team that has fantasy players on the opposing side of the Dallas Cowboys defense is going to get the start for me. And what that means for Travis Fulgham this week is another start for him. I think that Travis Fulgham has been phenomenal since he's been put into the starting lineup for the Eagles. He's put up really nice numbers. He's been actually very dominant at the point of catch. He's looked really, really, really good for that offense, and I think that he almost fits perfectly as the mold of wide receiver that Carson Wentz likes. It's that big, tall wide receiver who can box out the defender and make those contested grabs. So Travis Fulgham, definitely a great play this week, especially against a Dallas secondary that has relatively short corners and defensive backs. So Travis Fulgham could have a very big output this week, and I think that he's a guy that needs to be started in all lineups. To a lesser extent, another guy that I think is a must-start for fantasy lineups this week is Greg Ward, Travis Fulgham's teammate, who's also got the Cowboys, obviously. The Cowboys just can't guard anybody. It doesn't matter where you line up on the field. It doesn't matter how skilled you are or anything like that. If you're playing the Dallas Cowboys, you're going to score points. We just saw Washington tear their defense up last week with Kyle Allen. So obviously it can be done by anyone. Greg Ward has been very productive all season long. Carson Wentz depends on him. He trusts him. I think he's going to have a really nice game against the Cowboys, and I think that Greg Ward definitely deserves starting level consideration in your lineups. Tyler Boyd's another guy I really like starting in fantasy this week. I was talking about how the Steelers were able to find success throwing to their wideouts against the Tennessee defense, but how they were more opportunistic and got turnovers. So I think that this is a nice opportunity for Tyler Boyd and really that Bengals receiving core in general to step up and make plays against that secondary. I think that they can all tally a lot of yards, and I think that they can all have very productive afternoons. So Tyler Boyd's a guy I'm looking to put in my lineup this week, either at the wide receiver 2 or flex position. I think that he's got the chance to exceed his value and put up some game-winning numbers for your team this week. I think he's kind of stepped into that role as the number 1 wide receiver in the Cincinnati offense. So Tyler Boyd, if he can continue to produce here, I think that he, going forward, might be a must-start player regardless of matchup. But for now, Tyler Boyd is still a situational player for me. He's a very solid wide receiver too, but I feel more comfortable with him in the flex. I think that if Tyler Boyd continues to produce again this week against the Tennessee defense, he moves himself into that must-start territory on a weekly basis regardless of matchup. This is another player who's too easy to pick as a must-start guy here, and that's Robby Anderson for the Carolina Panthers. He's been phenomenal so far this season. He's been a really great deep ball threat for Teddy Bridgewater. And against the Falcons secondary, there's really no second thoughts that go into this. You're starting Robby Anderson this week. Don't be cute. I think that Robby Anderson is going to have a massive day. He's probably got the potential to have a really long touchdown over the top of the defense. So Robby Anderson 100% needs to be in all your guys' lineups. If you own him, he's going to put up some big numbers this week. Just because Robby Anderson is a must-start does not mean you guys can go forget about his teammate DJ Moore, who is arguably just as, if not more talented than Robby Anderson is. But DJ Moore has been slightly less productive so far this season, but still a fantastic fantasy player. He's had some really nice games so far, and I think that he continues to produce this week against the Falcons. Last week I said that these two were must-start players and that one of them was going to get a huge ball over the top for a touchdown, and DJ Moore walked in the end zone for a 73-yard touchdown on a deep ball that he just split the two safeties and made it look easy. So these two are highly productive wide receivers. They're very talented guys, and they definitely need to be in your lineups again this week. Marquise Brown is my next guy up here on the must-start wide receiver list. He's playing Pittsburgh this week, but they've shown that they are able to be opportunistic, get after the quarterback, and get takeaways, but they have not shown the ability to cover wide receivers on a consistent basis. Regardless of how many points they allow, how good their red zone defense is, you're still able to throw on this team. The Steelers let you win man-to-man coverage matchups, and Marquise Brown is very fast. He's going to have the opportunity to get a deep ball for a touchdown. I'm almost sure of it this week. He will get an open look down the field. Marquise Brown is going to have the opportunity to put up really nice numbers this week. He just has to cash in and deliver for your lineups. Another one of my favorite guys on the must-start list this week is Brandon Aiyuk against the Seattle Seahawks. He's moving into that wide receiver 1 territory for the San Francisco 49ers offense because Deebo Samuel has a hamstring strain, so he will not be present in the game against the Seahawks, and what that means is more volume for Brandon Aiyuk. Deebo Samuel was great on those end arounds against the Seahawks last year, and all of that workload is going to go to Aiyuk now that he's not going to be available. So Brandon Aiyuk is a very sneaky, under-the-radar play this week, and I think he has a humongous ceiling. So go start Brandon Aiyuk. I think he's going to be a very good player this week. Probably going to have one of his best games as a rookie wide receiver in the NFL. So Brandon Aiyuk definitely needs to be on rosters, and he needs to be in lineups this week. In deeper leagues, a guy to consider this week is Henry Ruggs of the Las Vegas Raiders, who's got the Cleveland Browns this week. Henry Ruggs has not been as productive as the Raiders probably expected so far in his rookie season, but Henry Ruggs is still a stud. He's still a burner. He's going to get open down the field. The Cleveland Browns struggle the most in pass coverage and in the secondary, so for a guy as fast as Henry Ruggs, he's a guy you can expect to maybe break away a huge touchdown. In deeper leagues, Henry Ruggs is a guy I'm considering in the flex. If you're in a league with only 8 or 10 people, though, I would refrain from starting Ruggs. This is more of an option for leagues with 12 to 14 members. My last must-start wide receiver this week is T. Higgins for the Cincinnati Bengals, who has the Tennessee Titans this week. Same deal as Tyler Boyd. T. Higgins has been phenomenal so far this season. He's been really productive as a rookie, and once he got on the field in that starting role, he has been really effective. He's had some really nice games, and him and Joe Burrow clearly have a very strong connection together. So I think T. Higgins is a guy who, moving forward, looks like one of those dominant wide receivers as a rookie in fantasy football. So going forward into next season, I'm excited to see how he's going to produce there. But T. Higgins this year is already a stud. This week he's got a nice matchup against the Tennessee Titans defense that has allowed those big plays down the field. And I think that T. Higgins deserves must-start value for that reason. My next segment of this video is going to be my short list of must-start tight ends. And the first guy I've got up on the list is Jimmy Graham, the Chicago Bears tight end, who is taking on his former team, the New Orleans Saints, this week. The Saints haven't covered the tight end all season long, and it seems like no matter the matchup every week, no matter who they're playing, the tight end always performs well. They just can't seem to cover the guys. Jimmy Graham has shown some very nice connection with Nick Foles so far this season, and I think that that continues here this week. Jimmy Graham, I'm going to predict, has a 2-touchdown game this week against his former team, and I think that he has a nice 50 to 60 receiving yards as well. So Jimmy Graham, definitely a must-start for me. I think that this might be one of the easier tight ends to start this week. Another guy who I'm starting at tight end this week is Johnu Smith against the Bengals, who have not defended the tight end very well either. So far this season, the Bengals have let up high fantasy point totals to the tight end position, and Johnu Smith has been on the downward trend the last couple of weeks, but I think he definitely bounces back here in this game. The Titans are going to be able to get back to their identity this week. They're going to be able to run the football. They're going to be able to run the play-action pass and those tight end screens. So Johnu Smith, definitely a guy I think trends back upward after this week, and I think that he needs to be in starting lineups if you don't already have a lock at the position for the week. My last must-start tight end this week is Dalton Schultz for the Dallas Cowboys. He's got the Eagles this week, and the Eagles just flat out haven't been able to cover the tight end either. George Kittle obviously had that massive, I think it was 13-catch game for almost 200 yards receiving and a touchdown. So Philly is not good against the tight end. Dalton Schultz is a guy who's going to be close to the quarterback in proximity on the field. He's going to be a check down. So I think that despite the quarterback play for the Dallas Cowboys, he's going to get some good looks, and he's going to get some looks as a safety blanket. So Dalton Schultz, he's going to see some checkdowns. You might see some nice volume this week. Go start him. Now we're going to get into my must-sit players for this week, and my first guy up on the board in the QB section is Big Ben Roethlisberger, the Steelers starting quarterback who has the Baltimore Ravens this week. The Ravens are just a very opportunistic defense. They're very good in the front seven and the back end. They're very opportunistic and get lots of takeaways. They get after the quarterback. They force pressures, and I think that ultimately they're going to minimize the amount of yards that the Steelers can put up offensively, and they're also going to take the football away as well. Ben Roethlisberger is a guy I really like going forward in fantasy after this week, but I think that going into this week, Ben Roethlisberger is a guy whose stock is down a little bit after a 3-pick game against the Titans last week, and I think he has another tough outing this week. So sit Ben Roethlisberger this week, and if you are not a Big Ben owner, I would actually look to trade for him after this week's performance. The next quarterback I'm sitting this week is an easy one. Cam Newton's probably lost your trust if you are a Newton owner in fantasy football this year. Obviously, he started off the season white hot, but Cam Newton has dramatically cooled off, and I think that now he does not have your trust in fantasy so far this season. He had negative points last week, which is terrible. That is almost impossible to do as a quarterback when you are a true starter for a team. He got benched at the end of the game by Bill Belichick. So Cam Newton is a guy you definitely do not trust anymore in fantasy. And I think that against the Bills defense that's very sound, they don't mess up, they don't give you free plays. I think that Cam Newton is not a guy you want in your starting lineups this week. My next QB up on the sit list is Matt Ryan for the Atlanta Falcons. Last time he played the Carolina Panthers, who is his opponent this week, he had 7 fantasy points just a few weeks ago. So Matt Ryan clearly struggles against the Panthers secondary. I think that there's other better options out there who you can stream at the quarterback position this week. And I think that in terms of players that you want to stay away from, Matt Ryan is definitely the type of guy this week. Even though he's got all those offensive weapons, Matt Ryan still tends to struggle against Carolina. So he's just not a guy you want to start this week. They're very good in the back end. They're very opportunistic. And Matt Ryan might have some turnovers as well. So stay off Matt Ryan if you can and look for another streaming option at quarterback this week. If you're forced to start Danny Dimes in fantasy this season, I feel really bad for you. But this week of all weeks, you certainly should not be playing him in your fantasy lineups. He's playing the Bucs this week, and for a quarterback who has been known to struggle for turning the football over and losing fumbles, the Tampa Bay defense is the last group you want to see Daniel Jones matched up against. They're very good at getting after the quarterback and forcing strip sacks. They're very good in the back end at getting takeaways and picks. So I think Daniel Jones is a terrible play in fantasy this week, and you guys should not even consider starting him in your lineups. Now into my must-sit running backs group. Mark Ingram tops off the group. The Ravens' backfield has just been irrelevant in fantasy football so far this season, and there's not really been one guy who you could really trust and depend on. So Mark Ingram coming off an injury and a bye week, but he's still questionable coming into this game. I'm definitely not even considering playing Mark Ingram. There's too many guys in the backfield, and Mark Ingram just hasn't produced like he did last season, so definitely not a route I want to go. There's far more better options out there than Mark Ingram in fantasy this week. This is kind of a 2-for-1 sit list here. Josh Kelley and Justin Jackson against the Denver Broncos are guys you do not want to start this week. The Broncos have the number 2 run stop in the NFL this season, so for guys who struggled last week to produce against the Jags D-line, you definitely don't want to be starting them against Denver. I think that their upside is very limited this week, and their floor is kind of shaky as well. So Josh Kelley and Justin Jackson are 2 players I do not like in fantasy this week. Try and find another option if you can. This is a similar deal as Boston Scott, but on the other end of the spectrum in terms of starting and sitting players. Chris Carson looks like he's going to miss this week's game, so Carlos Hyde is the next man up for the Seattle Seahawks, and he is a guy that I do not want to start in fantasy leagues this week. Carlos Hyde is playing the San Francisco 49ers, who are a very solid run-stop unit, and I think that they're going to shut down the Seahawks up front and probably win the battle at the line of scrimmage. So Carlos Hyde is definitely not a guy I'm looking to start this week. I think that they struggle to get the run game going against San Fran, and ultimately Russell Wilson is just going to be zinging the ball all over the place. So I think Carlos Hyde is definitely not a guy who you want to start this week, and I think that even if Chris Carson does go, with that injury, you're certainly suspect about him as well. My next guy up on the must-sit running backs list is Myles Gaskin, the starting running back for the Miami Dolphins. Myles Gaskin has a couple things working against him this week. The first thing is the Rams D-line has Aaron Donald on it, and he is going to eat up blocks, which makes it nearly impossible to run the football against. Miami is going to have a tough week offensively, and especially starting a rookie quarterback in his first ever game midway through the season. I think that there's just too many things that can go wrong for the Dolphins offense, and so Myles Gaskin, as a result, is a guy you want to stay away from. I'm really rooting for Tua, but this is a tough game to walk into the NFL against, so definitely a guy I'm looking to sit this week is Myles Gaskin and Tua Tagovailoa. To be honest, if you guys picked him up in any leagues, stay away from your Dolphins offensive players this week. I think it might be a rough outing against a stout Rams defensive unit. Every week, this is a very simple must-sit suggestion for me, and that is anyone who is playing the New Orleans Saints needs to sit the running back on the other side of the football playing against them because they haven't allowed a 100-yard rusher in forever. So the Saints are very stout up front. They are not going to let you run the football against them. And in turn, that means that David Montgomery is going to suffer as a fantasy football player. So definitely not starting any running backs against the Saints this week or the rest of the football season. So David Montgomery gets the short end of the stick this week, and I think that he needs to be on your bench for all lineups. Now into my must-sit wide receivers list. This is actually a relatively short list this week in comparison to normal, but a bit of a shocker here to start things off. At the top of the list, I've got Adam Thielen, the Viking star wide receiver, who is actually one of the top fantasy producers right now. But he's going to face shadow coverage from Jair Alexander against the Packers this week. Jair Alexander has shut down all opposing wide receivers this season. He held Calvin Ridley catchless. He did a number on Adam Thielen in week 1 until garbage time, and then he was able to shut down Will Fuller until garbage time when he was pulled from the game as well against the Texans. Mike Evans did next to nothing when Jair was guarding him against the Buccaneers. He's been really, really good so far this season, and I think that Adam Thielen gets another rough outing this week. Wide receivers are so plentiful in fantasy football, I think it's not very difficult to find a guy you can put in for Adam Thielen, so he's definitely a guy who you want to start, but I think that his ceiling is limited this week due to the matchup in the secondary. Another shocker here is that Tyler Lockett is on my must-sit list for fantasy wide receivers this week. He just had a monster game last week, 15 for 203 touchdowns, I believe. So Tyler Lockett coming off a career day. But Tyler Lockett this week has the San Francisco 49ers secondary that has went from 0 to 100 in the last 3 weeks or so. Jason Verrett has came back as that player that is completely dominant that we last saw on the Chargers like 4 or 5 years ago. He looks insane. And the San Fran defense as a whole has held up very well despite the injuries they've faced all over the board. So I think Tyler Lockett's big game last week means that he's going to have shadow coverage from Verrett this week. I think that Tyler Lockett is going to struggle against Verrett. It's not that he's going to be held catchless or anything by any means, but I think that in terms of that high ceiling you guys are looking for out of Lockett this week, he's not going to put up those numbers against the solid San Francisco defense. Getting close to wrapping things up here, one of my last must-sit players of the week is Darius Slayton, the Giants wide receiver, taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Like I said, Danny Dimes is going to struggle this week against the Tampa Bay defense, so that means he's going to have issues getting Darius Slayton the football, and they're very good in the secondary in Tampa Bay, so I think Darius Slayton is going to be very limited. Daniel Jones is not going to have the time to sit back and throw deep balls to Darius Slayton, which is what he does well, so I think that this is just a lose-lose situation for Slayton and Jones. Very, very unfavorable matchup for the two this week, and I think that they should not be in your lineups this week. My last must-sit player of the week is JuJu Smith-Schuster, the Pittsburgh Steelers' number 1 wide receiver in terms of the depth chart. That's not necessarily how the numbers have been distributed so far this year, but JuJu Smith-Schuster is still a very solid talent. But against the Ravens this week, where I think that they are going to send the toughest coverage in Juju's way, he's definitely a guy that I would look to keep on my bench this week. I think that Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool have higher upside this week just due to the fact that they're probably not going to see Marlon Humphrey for the majority of the game, but JuJu Smith-Schuster is a solid talent. He's just going to struggle this week, and he has also kind of lost that must-start territory in fantasy, so another guy I would look to avoid this week. That'll conclude my Week 8 lineup advice video. If you guys have any comments or questions about your team specifically, make sure to comment those down below, and I'll be sure to get back to you guys. Thank you guys so much for the continued support on the channel, and all of you new guys who have just joined the channel recently within the last couple days here and are now contributing to the channel. It means a lot to me that you guys are taking time out of your day to visit the channel and be a part of this. So thank you guys so much. I think that the channel is on the rise, and we're going to do some really cool things here going forward. So, again, thank you guys so much for your time. Thank you guys so much for your support. Until next time, peace out.